morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining me from. Thank you very much for taking time of your busy schedule to be with me in this 1 hour talking about exploratory testing. My name is Magdi Hanna. I will be your speaker for this webinar. I'm also the chairman and CEO of the International Institute for Software Testing. Just in case, if you have not attended free webinars or courses from the International Institute for Software Testing before, IIST is a leader in education-based certifications and software testing training around the world. You can follow us on this social media. You can also look at our website. We have over 100 courses covering every aspect of software testing and quality assurance. We also have 12 different types of certifications. I can see the names of attendees here. I can recognize some of them as some people who have actually attended our training. I know some of them by name, and I can see some of them also have attended our certifications. Well, I'm happy to spend the next hour with you here talking about exploratory testing, but not exploratory testing as most people think of it. There has been different opinions about exploratory testing since it started back. I'm going to have to say the first time I heard something about exploratory testing was perhaps 1997, around that time, when I had invited one of the pioneers of exploratory testing to make a presentation at one of our conferences, and he made a presentation with the title, "Just Doing Enough Testing." At the time, I have to be honest with you, I did not like the idea of doing just enough testing. Especially IIST from the very beginning has been teaching people how to do disciplined, formal testing. However, when I learned about the idea and the concept from the beginning, gradually I started to be convinced. But over the years, I found a way to incorporate exploratory testing into a formal, disciplined test design process. And that's what I am going to speak with you today about it. Okay. So during this webinar, please feel free to provide your comments/questions by clicking on the questions tab in your control panel. And I will try to peek into those questions or comments as I'm speaking so that I can answer your questions as we go. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available at the IIST website sometime next week. And I hope you don't get confused here. You can go to either iist.org or testinginstitute.com. They both are routing to the same website. All right, let's move on. Before I start, I want to get your thoughts here about what you think exploratory testing really is. I want you to give me a sentence or two, if you will, to tell me how do you define exploratory testing, what it means to you, just to be able to know where you come from. Go ahead and click on the questions tab and provide your input. Okay, I got the first response here, a combination of negative and positive testing. Well, this does not tell me much because formal testing is also a combination of negative and positive testing, or at least it's supposed to be. So perhaps when you tell me exploratory testing for you means a combination of negative and positive testing, does this mean that you're not including negative testing in your formal testing? I guess with that definition, Here I'll have to say, so what is the difference between your definition of exploratory testing and formal testing? That's, of course, if we agree on what formal testing is anyway. Another response says, testing the software while exploring them. All right, not sure what that means. Of course, we all know about exploring, so testing while exploring. All right, at least that's as close as it can get to some of the definitions provided by people who have worked on exploratory testing in the early years. Any other thoughts? Any idea? I'm going to have to believe that some of you have done exploratory testing before. Maybe not. All right, well, let's get another question here. So when do you use it? And I'm using the phrase or the question when here to leave it open-ended. I'm going to leave it up to you to provide me with when do you do it in terms of time, in the beginning, at the end, early, late, or in what situations you use it. Okay, I'm getting an idea here that not too many of the people attending with me today have a clear idea about what exploratory testing is. Okay, a response here says unscripted testing while learning the software or while testing new functionality at the start of testing. Thank you. Thank you, Janine. Very thorough answer. Unscripted testing while learning the software or while testing new functionality at the start of the testing. Okay, I'll take that. Another extension of the answer, we use exploratory testing throughout the entire development. Okay, and I will have to agree with that as well. Okay, let's move on because I have so much material to cover today, and let me not waste any more time, but thanks for those of you who responded. And I'm going to go a little bit quick on the initial slides here because, again, I want to get to the meat of the presentation. So if we were to talk about the test design discipline, the highest level of discipline is scripted testing. And I can see Janine said unscripted testing, exploratory testing is unscripted. And she's right because exploratory testing is very much at the other extreme of the discipline. So the highest level of discipline is scripted testing. Then the next level is what we call informal scripted. So scripted means that we're going to be using it to execute the testing using an automated tool. Informal scripted possibly is what we call manual scripting. So you write the steps, but not as formal, not as details. Okay. Then after that, it comes the exploratory testing, which really has no scripts at all, not formal, not informal, but rather unscripted testing. Okay, but let's not forget that there is another level down here, which I refer to it as ad hoc or on-the-fly testing. Now, I'm going to have to explain to you that my differences between exploratory versus ad hoc. I've seen a lot of people, equating the two of them, saying ad hoc is exploratory testing or exploratory testing is done as ad hoc. I have a different opinion of that. All right, so here are some, so the discipline goes in that direction here. Here are some definitions and ideas about scripted testing. You all know about it. Scripts are written in advance. There are steps to execute the tests. There are steps to make sure that whatever we need to prepare before we run the tests are written. There are steps to verify the results and so on. But we all agree that not every functionality and not every type of software needs to have scripted testing. There must be some place for exploratory testing. Now, informal scripted means that we write the steps, but not on any specific scripting language to be executed using automated tool, but rather we use it in plain English. We write it in plain English so that it can be done manually. And many of these scripts are very informal. not giving much details. I'm gonna just go over that. Now, the definition of exploratory testing. This is just one definition of many definitions out there, maybe hundreds of definitions out there on the literature. But I chose a definition by Kim Kainer, perhaps because it is the one definition that makes more sense to me, and I kind of underlined the phrases that stand out to me. It's a personal freedom, so the personal freedom of the tester to explore, and the responsibility of the individual tester to do a couple of things at the same time. Okay, to test, to explore, to test, to optimize their tests based on the interpretation of results. Okay, so as I said, Kim is really, he's the one who puts some thoughts into the process. It doesn't mean that everyone else did not, but what can I say? I think I like this definition because it focuses so much on the exploration piece. What I don't like about it, if any, there is no mention of documentation. But I do strongly believe that Kim Kainer strongly believes that exploratory testing must have some level of documentation. I don't think Kim Kainer would advocate exploratory testing without documentation. But anyway, so here is ad hoc testing. Okay. It has an element of exploration to it, but you just sit down and test based on looking at screen, looking at functionality, and explore. Now, still, someone says, so what is the definition? What's the difference? So this seems to be exploratory. This seems to be what we do in exploratory. I hope not. I hope not. Because there is a place for exploratory testing with some level of documentation. There is a place for ad hoc testing, and I will explain the difference in a little bit. Okay, so I say just explore. To me, ad hoc testing, this is the closest I can tell you. This is the closest analogy. To me, ad hoc testing is like going on a trip somewhere, doesn't matter where. Going to a trip in Paris or London or to the East Coast or wherever. And you have no plan of what you're going to do there, except, of course, hopefully you have the reservation at the hotel where you are going to stay. But if anyone were to ask you, say, what would you do there? You say, I don't know, I am just going to explore. And you get there and you start exploring places and sites. The fear of that is that you might be exploring the wrong places. You might be spending a week there and then come back and people ask you, how was your trip? And you say, it was okay. Why was it just okay? Because you did not have a plan. Because you just went to explore. And you are not a good explorer. Let me put it that way. If you are not a good explorer and if you do not know what to explore, then you can get yourself in trouble by wasting so much time exploring the wrong things that are useless, that are not interesting, and that's why the whole trip for you becomes not so interesting. Now, that tells you that if you are going to explore, then you need to do some planning. That's what I'm getting at. So if I were to summarize the difference between exploratory testing and ad hoc testing in one sentence, I say it's planning. Ad hoc testing is exploratory testing without any planning. All right, let's move on. Most people who strongly believe in exploratory testing says because the human brain is able to find more bugs without any restrictions. Don't restrict me to a script. Don't restrict me to steps I have to follow. Don't restrict me with the specific things I have to do. Let me just explore and I will find problems. And I do agree. However, as I said, we've got to be careful about what to explore and when. Here are some concerns that I have sometimes about exploratory testing, the way it is performed in practice. As I said, you may waste time exploring the wrong things. There is no evidence of coverage. If I ask you how much of the requirement or how much of the user story or how much of the code have you covered, you don't have an idea. Let me tell you, requirement coverage and the code coverage are two essential things in our testing practices. You have to have a good idea about how much of the requirement or the user story have you covered and how much of the code have you covered. And let me tell you that code coverage is far, far more important than requirement coverage. Why? Because you can test and you can cover as much of the details of the requirement or the user story as possible. But there is some code there that was written by your developers that you are not aware of. And I'm speaking from my experience here with a major project that I was involved in. And let me just briefly say the code coverage for that kind of project was no more than 58%, which means there is 42% of the code has not been tested. So you've got to be very careful about that, because exploratory testing is not going to help you cover a lot of the code, because you're trying to cover what's on the screen in front of you. And also, it does not help you cover a lot of details about the requirement, because there's so much details that you may not see just from the user interface. It's again, it's like going into that trip and passing by a site, and you simply read what is written there and you say, yeah, that's not interesting to me, let's not go there, let's not spend enough time there. And it turns out that this would have been the most interesting thing in your trip if you have taken the time to do it. If you're doing exploratory testing with documentation, that's great. But what I've seen in most practices of exploratory testing is that there is no repeatability, meaning that if you want to come back and include some of those tests in your regression test suite, which is critical, of course, because in a regression test suite, you always want to include all the critical tests that you executed in the past to make sure they still pass in the new release that you're about to put out to your customers. I have not seen any project, any group, any team able to include their exploratory test cases into the regression test suite. I want you to think about that. And if your team is doing something different, please let me know. Go ahead and share it in the questions tab. I would love to hear that. I would love to hear that some people are doing exploratory testing, but they're coming back to say those exploratory tests that we did need also to be included in our regression test suite so that we can include it in every regression test we do. All right. I'm hoping to hear back from you soon in the questions tab so that I can share with everyone else. So it has always been my opinion that we need a more disciplined exploratory testing, because it allows for repeatability. It allows us to include the exploratory tests in our regression test suite. If people leave the projects, here's the thing. I mean, we all know that exploratory tests depend on the skills of the person. And some people are good explorers and some people are not. All right. And it really does, to a certain extent, it depends on the years of experience, but not all the time. Not all the time. I have seen junior testers coming in and doing better exploration than people who have been around for 10 years. Okay. That's not to say that people with experience do not know how to explore, but I'm saying that experience is not an important factor, although the majority of exploratory testers are experienced testers. Again, I want to hear from you anything different from this. It's my opinion, my experience. Okay, here is something important as well. If we're going to do a lot of exploratory testing, all right, now we go into status reporting, and we're trying to put out how much testing have we done, or what did we test. In a way, requirement coverage. In fact, in my testing process, I have a requirement coverage matrix, which shows the user stories or the requirements on the left and the test cases on the right. And it tells me for each one of the user stories and or requirement, how many test cases were executed, how many were written, how many have not been executed yet, how many passed, how many failed. But guess what? In those test cases, I include both formal tests and exploratory tests. So you need to watch for that, because otherwise you're going to be, if you're only including those tests that you wrote scripts for, then you're undermining the level of testing you have done. You're saying for this feature or this user story, we've done, say, 10 tests. But although, in fact, you've done 25 tests, but 15 of those were exploratory. So that's why we need more disciplined approach to exploratory testing to account for those exploratory tests in our status report. Now, I have always taken the chance to use the results of our test execution to prevent defects. Let me tell you this upfront, and you'll hear this often from me in my courses. If your testing effort does not help you prevent defects in the future, then you're really wasting a lot of time. You see that I wrote here QA versus testing. If your testing effort does not help you and your team prevent defects in the future, all that you're doing is testing. You are not practicing quality assurance at all. Because quality assurance is explicitly about what? About using the results of your testing to improve the process that's being used to build the software to eliminate defects in future releases. If you want to learn more about this, you can listen to or you can attend my courses on best practices in software test planning and design, or actually do some reading for Dr. Edward Deming. I have learned this from Dr. Edward Deming from the early days, early 1982, 1983, right? Because if all what we're doing is testing, then we're wasting the time. I tell people all the time, you have to become a true quality assurance person in heart, which means you test with, and your test process has to have a way to improve your development, your requirement, your coding, all the processes that are used to build the software. Otherwise, we are not preventing defects. Now, if we are doing exploratory testing without documentation or with minimal documentation, we're losing the chance of doing process improvement for the purpose of defect prevention. All right, here is my quick exploratory testing process. Now, what you see here immediately is that it is very much like my formal testing process. It has the 4 phases. There's exploratory test planning, test design, test execution, and bug reporting. Of course, any one of you would say, really, do we design exploratory tests? Absolutely. However, we don't design exploratory tests the same way we design formal testing. Do we plan for exploratory tests? Absolutely, but in a very different way. Now, I know I did not tell you this, and I don't mean to try to do a sales pitch here, but the details of this process is explained in my 2-day course on exploratory testing. The course is going to be offered sometime in August. I believe I have the slide later on in the presentation, but also it is available as an online self-paced pre-recorded course. So because I see I'm putting a chart in front of you, but I'm not explaining the process. These are the 4 phases and the definition of each one of them. The planning is about what to test. The design is about what to test, but on a lower level. And the execution is about running the tests you planned and designed in the previous 2 steps, but with exploration in mind. Bug reporting is the same way. It's writing the bug report. However, when we write the bug report, is with exploration in mind. So going back to this, my chart, you can see 2 things about this. One is that there is so much overlap between the 4 phases. So it's not a sequential process. So which means I can be performing all these at the same time. So I wanted to emphasize this because once some of you sees that I have 4 phases, say, oh, no, that's going to take a lot of time. It does not. I'm talking about a process here that takes a total of 30 minutes. All of it, all the phases. But aside from the fact that there is a lot of overlap in the time frame, there is also feedback from each phase or from each step back to the previous steps. So I can basically be sitting down here doing exploratory bug reports, meaning what? I'm writing a bug report, but when I write the bug report, I'm not trying to report the problem I found only, but I'm trying to explore further to see if there is a possibility of a related problems or better yet, a related scenarios that I need to execute. So I may go back to run another exploratory test without designing or pre-designing or planning. Or I may go all the way to designing one more exploratory test so that I can execute it, so that I can decide if there is another bug report that I need to include, or I need to include more details in this bug report. So that's why you can see you've got to have your eyes open all the time when you do exploratory testing. And you already know it, that not everyone can do exploratory testing. It's not for everyone. So keep that in mind, the feedback from every step back to all the previous steps. I can be running tests here, but while running the tests, I can find out there are more tests that I cannot execute right away, but I need to write some planning for it. I need to decide on what to test on a higher and lower level. I know I'm speaking very abstract here, but I guess we need some examples, but my 1 hour is not enough for that. So here is very briefly on one slide. I mean, this one slide here in my course takes about 3 hours to explain. So what do we do in test planning? And that, as you can see, on a high level, what features do we test? What dependencies are between those features? Okay, to what extent we're going to test each feature? This is, as you can see, this is not the same kind of test planning we do in formal testing. Well, there are other things we do in test planning with formal testing, but this is exploratory test planning. The most important thing in this test planning is what scenarios am I going to test for each feature, whether that feature is represented by a requirement or a user story. How do we expect the system to respond or to react to what I am testing? Someone says, is that our expected results? Sort of. It's your expected results on a very high level. Okay, so you talk about the scenario to test, and you talk about, okay, how do I expect the system to deal with that? Does the system reject it? Does the system give an error message? Does the system accept it and process it? Whatever. Now, when it comes to the exploratory test design, as I said, it's what are we testing on a lower level? Okay, So what input and what preconditions I'm going to be using. And now I'm getting a little bit into writing the test itself. I have to. Even if I'm not writing it down, but I have to think about it. Am I going to test for this input and this input or not? And if I'm testing it, I mean, if I'm looking at screen and I'm clicking buttons and controls, I have to think about preconditions. Let me define what preconditions are. I'm sure you probably heard the term before. What is the state of the system at the time I'm trying to explore? So if I am clicking on a button to test something on a website or in a given application, I have to think about the state of the system at the time. Very simple. I mean, let me give you a simple example. I have a button that says cancel. So you say, okay, let me test that. Cancel what? Oh, you're going to cancel an order. But don't you need to think about what if that this order has been canceled before? Don't you want to think about how was this order paid? Don't you want to think about whether this order is a refundable order or non-refundable order? See, these are the kind of things that you do not see on the screen. That's what I'm talking about. So you click on cancel to cancel an order and you get what you expect is, oh, okay, good. The order has been canceled. But what if that order was non-refundable? Or what if that order was canceled before? So that's why you think about preconditions. I am sure some of you, when you do exploratory testing, you are thinking about these things. I'm just inviting you to be thorough when you think about these things. What environment? By environment here, I mean hardware and software. It's a tiny bit of what we do in test planning in formal testing. And what should we expect? That's really your expected results. Absolutely. And that's probably my point of disagreement with most people who do exploratory testing. In my opinion, there is no exploratory testing without some sort of perceived expected behavior. Okay. I know when we explore, we just go and explore. And I ask people a lot, and they say, what do you expect? And they say, well, I don't know. I'm just exploring it to see how it works. Well, that's not good then. Because how are you going to judge if that test is a pass or a fail? How are you going to judge if the software did what it's supposed to do or did not what it's supposed to do if you do not know what it is supposed to do? I hope I'm being clear here. So you've got to have some rough idea about what to expect. All right. How do I fit an exploratory test process into a disciplined test design process? If you have attended my courses in software testing, especially the course on best practices on software test planning and the design, you probably have seen something similar to this. You have user stories, you have requirements, leave the right hand side for now, it's use cases, but the most important thing is what we do what? We build the scenarios. This is what I refer to as a scenario-based development and testing. All this applies perfectly with exploratory test planning. So you've got a user story, or you got a requirement, or you got use case. You have to build the scenarios because scenarios are about what are we testing on a very high level. Scenarios are not your test cases. Absolutely not. Scenarios are simple phrases that says, here are a few things that could possibly happen in production. I want to make sure that the system does what it's supposed to do in these scenarios. Okay. So the outcome of the test planning phase in my own process is scenarios. Now, we typically in a formal test process, we take those scenarios and we build formal test cases for those. And formal test cases have lots of details: input, preconditions, output, post conditions. Then we start writing our automated scripts. We start to group those test cases into test sets. And for each test set, we might write either an automated script or a manual script. All right. Here is my introduction of the exploratory testing. So far, I could just do exploratory testing like this, based on user stories and requirements. And I still have to come up with scenarios. And that's the beauty of it, that I can actually explore before I get the user interface. Once I get the user interface, I can use the user interface to come up with more scenarios. I may still have to have some discussion though. So I try to come up with scenarios. Again, scenarios are nothing more than one phrase. Okay, I hear some people doing exploratory testing saying that they write the charter. So your charter might very well correspond to what I'm referring to as scenarios, except in my scenarios, I also have my expected behavior. I told you earlier, there is no exploratory testing without expected results or expected behavior. The difference here is that I could take scenarios and instead of writing formal test cases, I write exploratory test cases. And I'll tell you the difference between an exploratory test case and a formal test case in a little bit. Okay? But do I have to have the user interface? This is really the difference. Do I have to have the user interface in order to do exploratory testing? And the answer is no. I can start my exploratory testing early by writing lots of scenarios and discuss those scenarios with my product owner, business analyst, developers, whoever. So that when I get the user interface available, I start doing more validations for my scenarios, and I might come up with more scenarios and then start writing my exploratory test cases and just execute them. Now, I may actually, again, for the purpose that I said earlier, being able to include my exploratory tests into my regression test suite, I may actually group my exploratory tests into groups, so that I may also write an automated script or a manual script, or not. But at least I have them documented, okay? So here is a simple process for you. How do I think about scenarios based on the user interface? You start with the user interface. You analyze it. And this is kind of teaching exploratory testing to people who are not very good in exploring. You start with user interface. You start with any screen. Please don't rush to execute or to run tests, because you need to ask lots of questions. If you know what it does, I'm okay with that. I don't have the time here to tell you what kind of questions you ask, but again, I do this in my courses. There are so many questions. I mean, just seeing one field where you're supposed to enter data, you're gonna just enter any data? And some people say, yeah, I'm gonna just try anything. Wrong. Because you need to know what we call the validation rules of that field. What's valid, what's not invalid. Because if you do not know the validation rule for the field, then you do not know what valid and what invalid data you use. If you look at a button that you're about to click, I don't want you to click it right away. I want you to step back and say, what if I click this button after I already did this, or before I did that? I'm talking here about the preconditions of the process. So in a nutshell, you have to ask questions. And through asking the questions, you learn more. And as you learn, you start writing scenarios. Don't rush to execute your tests, because that's considered exploring without planning. Don't do that. So you write scenarios. You may be clear about how it works, and you go from the user interface directly to write scenarios. What if you got the user interface, but you are not aware of the requirement or the user story? Remember, Sometimes we get user interface that was designed through a prototyping process, and the details of the requirement have not been yet written. Let me tell you that much. People write high-level requirements or high-level user story, and developers take it right away and start building the user interface, which is a not bad thing, by the way. This is the way Agile development should work. So you've got prototyped screens, you have user interface, but you don't have the details of the requirement or the user story. So that's why I sometimes say you may, based on questions you ask and answers you receive, you may also be interested to come up with the details of the user story. You got a requirement that says customers may place orders online and pay for them online. Okay, high level requirement or user story. As a customer, I want to be able to place an order and pay for it by credit card. Okay, but there's no details there. When you see the user interface, you ask questions, you start learning more details about things like what happens if someone places an order for multiple items, that some of them are available in inventory and some of them are not. Well, is this details written anywhere? No. It's details in the requirement that were never written anywhere. So that is why you might want to write that level of details here. Or just say, I'm going to write a scenario to address that. You see now that how exploration without planning does not work? Let's move on. I have a simple process. I call it explore, learn, document, and ask a plan. Very simple. So based on what I just told you, you explore the user interface. And all these this slide and the previous slide is based on doing user interface, doing sort of a user interface based exploratory testing, or exploring user interface to do exploratory testing. So you explore, keep exploring. Don't act yet. Again, you're exploring places for eating, for food. What do? Do you actually go and first restaurant you see, you go and eat there? Absolutely not. We don't do that. So, but what do? You walk around, you explore, you say, okay, that's Chinese food. Yes, but let me look at the menu. Does it have what I like? No. Yeah, the prices are a bit higher. Now, let's move to the next one. You start exploring. And while exploring, you're learning. But you must always document what you learn. In testing, of course, you're not going to document what you learn about restaurants. And in order to confirm or verify what you learned and documented, you need to ask questions. Of course, I'm sure by now, everyone is saying, ask who? Well, ask whoever can answer your question. Ask the product owner. Ask the business analyst, ask the developer. But the developer probably, in my opinion, is the last person to ask. No offense here. No offense at all. I have nothing against developers. But if you ask developers about how it's supposed to work or what does this mean, what do you think they're going to tell you? They're going to tell you what the answer is in their mind. If they misunderstood the requirement and misinterpreted the user story, they're going to answer you based on their own misinterpretation. So anyway, don't trust the answer from the developer yet, unless you don't have a product owner or a business analyst to ask. Or at the very least, ask someone who's more familiar with the system than you, who's been around longer, who knows how it's supposed to work. Okay, and so on. You ask, you get answers, you either cancel what you documented and learned, or you confirm it, and you keep doing that. That's the exploration process. And out of the documentation here, you come up with your scenarios. Okay. I wanted to give you an example of a scenario here. I only have 10 minutes left. In general, this is how I document scenarios with the title. I check in for a flight after flight took off. This is not a user story. This is not a requirement. This is a situation or a condition that could possibly happen in production when the system is trying to perform that process of checking into a flight to get your boarding pass. Or I am convinced that it is possible that someone tries to go online and check into the flight after the flight has already taken off. Can this possibly happen? I think it would be mistaken if we say no. It could happen. Someone can try to do that. Now, there is expected behavior here. It would be a mistake not to think about the expected behavior. Because with the common sense we know is that the system should not allow a person to check into a flight and to get a boarding pass after the flight has already taken off. Maybe the check-in button is disabled, and that answers all our trouble. Now, preconditions. Do you want to think about if that person has a reservation on that flight or not? I mean, can I go to any flight and check in and get my boarding pass, even if I don't have a reservation? I never paid for that flight? Of course not. So you've got it. Okay, that's the preconditions I'm talking about. Before you click that button that says check in, don't you want to think about whether this person you're checking in has already checked in before or not? Yes. Because clicking a button or the result, the expected result, or what you expect when you click that button, it depends on the preconditions, or as I said earlier, the state of the system. So you got to think about preconditions, you got to think about expected behavior. But I'm here talking about scenarios. So when you write scenarios, you write them this way. When you write your test cases, I'm not asking you to document it too much. I'm asking you to have an exploratory test case number. That's required because that's how we refer to them in our test log and everything. You have a title of the test case and you have expected results. And please don't tell me I am just exploring to see how it works. Because if you do not have that, you cannot judge if the system does what's supposed to do the way it's supposed to do it or not. If you have time, you can provide description, but I think you can write the title up here to be as descriptive as possible, so you don't need the description. I suggest that you write the preconditions, but if you have time, but at least think about them. Think about the input, whether it's going to be valid or invalid input. And the only way you know what input to use is, as I said earlier, by knowing the validation rules of the field you are trying to, or the button or the field you're trying to enter data for. So now I showed you what a scenario looks like and what an exploratory test looks like. It becomes straightforward now to take your scenarios and they become your exploratory tests. I know you've already got tired and you said, am I going to come up with scenarios and I'm going to come up with exploratory test cases? That's a lot of work. I'm just asking you to come up with scenarios. And now compose your first exploratory test case as below. Use the scenario title to become the title of your exploratory test. Use the scenario expected behavior to be the test case expected results. Very straightforward. If you have written preconditions for your scenarios, they become the preconditions of your test. And you're done. So writing the scenarios up front, whether it is based on, I'm going to go back here, writing the scenarios up front, whether it is based on user stories, requirements, or user interface, or even use cases, is not such a bad idea, because we are using those scenarios to create our exploratory test cases. Let me go forward. And then, that's your first exploratory test. And start to think about more exploratory test cases by doing what? By changing the preconditions. Interesting. So if you did not think about preconditions, you do not have a chance to create exploratory tests from one another. So you will run one exploratory test and you're done. But if I thought about preconditions and I said, oh, one of the preconditions here is that that person has already checked in, has not checked in, for example, and you run a test case using that precondition. I want you to go back and think about another test case by saying, okay, what if I change the precondition to try to click that button, check in, but while the person I'm trying to check in has already checked in before. Now you can see you are exploring based on knowledge. That's very intelligent exploring. Okay, now here's what I call the desperate approach. Don't even write exploratory tests. Just write your scenarios and execute them. Executing the scenarios. If you documented your scenarios, make sure that you got the scenario number, the scenario title, and your expected behavior. So that becomes your exploratory test. And just go and execute the scenarios. Good enough? And log the actual behavior that you got and log whether the test case pass or fail based on whether the actual behavior meets your expected behavior. But you see, I am now asking you, or I'm giving you an idea to do what I call scenario-based exploratory testing. Scenario-based exploratory testing. I have been using my process, scenario-based development and testing, for years with different companies. And companies have told me that it worked amazingly. It helped them reduce the number of bug reports coming from their customers by more than 70%. Why? Because it discovers all the bugs early enough. Okay, so that's scenario-based exploratory test execution. No exploratory test design anymore. So we'll just write the scenarios. Okay. So you've got three options to take here. You start with the user interface. You write scenarios, and you write your exploratory tests. And based on your exploratory test cases, you can go back, write more scenarios. And when you take those exploratory tests, you go and execute them. During execution, because you're executing with exploratory in mind, you might discover more scenarios to write and so on. Or take the simple way, go ahead, as I mentioned, from the user interface, write your scenarios, execute them. And while you're executing, you're exploring, you might write more scenarios. And here you explore, you execute, you document while executing the scripts. What is that now? This is simply saying you've got scripted tests and you are sitting there to execute the scripts. Now, if the scripts are automated scripts, the tool is executing them and you have no way to be creative there because you're giving all control to the tool. If those are manual scripts and you're executing them manually, I encourage you to keep your eyes open for exploration while you are executing scripted tests, because then you can learn about more and more and more scenarios that you can test using exploratory tests. So this is exploring while you are executing manual scripts. This is the third option. You can do all of them at the same time. I'm not asking that you choose one. You can do all of them. Sometimes you do this. Sometimes when you don't have time to do this, and sometimes your exploratory tests would be only limited to you exploring during executing the scripts. This is nothing here new. I already told you about all this. Always document what you test, whether it's ad hoc or exploratory. Always combine exploratory testing with other forms of formal pre-designed tests. Keep in mind, if you only test based on the written requirements, you are not testing enough. It does not give you enough coverage, even if you are looking at the requirement. That's why you have to explore. Executing scripts manually or automated is never enough. Okay, so you got to complement it with or supplemented with some level of exploration. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar is 1 hour summary of the course with the same title that's going to be offered as an online interactive course on August 22, 23. And you can register for it at the Testing Institute website by going to the interactive courses there. If you cannot make those dates, then the course is available as a self-paced pre-recorded course you can take anytime. You have 30 days to finish the course and watch the course recording as many times as you wish. Thank you so much for being with me today. I hope you found this webinar to be useful for you, and I hope to see you in future webinars.